The flight started out normally, with first-class passengers settling in and flight attendants walking through the aisles. An older veteran quietly took his seat, but then things took a dramatic turn when an angry flight attendant slammed into him in front of everyone. She didn't ask any questions or check the facts, she just assumed. The cabin went silent as people stared in shock. She thought she was correcting an old man who didn't belong, but what she didn't know was that the man she had just embarrassed owned the skies more. Before we start the story, let us know where in the world you are watching from today, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss another one. The airport was busy with people going through security lines and looking at departure boards. One of them was an old man named Eder Colt. His steps were measured, and he stood tall and quietly authoritatively. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and his sharp brown eyes showed that he was wise and experienced. He wore a well-fitted navy suit and a small military pin on his lapel. It was the only thing that made him stand out. As he approached the boarding gate, a young woman with a friendly smile looked at his ticket and said, "You're all set, Mr. Hull. Enjoy your flight." He politely nodded and went through the door, stepped forward and moved steadily across the jet bridge. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin was already full of people settling into their large seats, adjusting their pillows and pulling out their devices. Eddie moved to his assigned seat and put his leather bag in the overhead compartment with ease. As he sat down in the plush seat, he looked out the window and rested his fingers lightly on the armrest. He had flown many times before, but every flight had an air of mystery about it. Of familiarity, like stepping into a world where time seemed to stop between destinations. The moment was cut short by a sharp voice, "Sir, I think you're in the wrong section." He turned his face so that the flight attendant standing a few feet away could see him and looked at her. Clarissa Ball was tall and blonde, and she was dressed perfectly, with every hair tucked tightly into her head. She looked at him with the cool detachment of someone who had already made up her mind. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out his boarding pass, holding it out calmly. Clarissa hesitated before taking it, her eyes scanning over the details. A flash of confusion crossed her face, but she quickly covered it up. She handed the ticket back with a forced smile, saying, "I just wanted to double-check." Her tone was full of the kind of politeness that wasn't meant to be polite at all. Eddie kept quiet as he put the pass back into his jacket. He knew the look in her eyes, he had seen it many times before. A businessman named Jonas Clay looked up from his laptop and watched the exchange with a mild sense of curiosity before going back to his work. A woman in a designer dress named Lena Whitmore read a magazine while avoiding eye contact and acting like she hadn't heard the energy in the cabin change. Clarissa turned on her heel and walked away, leaving a lingering sense of tension. Eddie leaned back in his seat and ran his fingers along the edge of his armrest. He had been through much worse, but this was nothing compared to what he was going through. None of them knew it, but this flight was about to become a moment they would never forget, and Clarissa Ball was about to make the worst decision of her career. As the last of the first-class passengers settled in and the overhead bins closed one by one, Eddie tightened his seat belt and looked out the window as the hum of the engines filled the cabin. The flight crew moved through the aisles doing final checks before takeoff. The moment should have passed. The only thing that had happened was an awkward exchange and a quick mistake that would go away as soon as the plane took off, but Clarissa Ball wasn't done. She lingered near the galley and watched Eddie out of the corner of her eye, her mind going over and over again. Something about the way he looked at her, calm, unwavering, and unshaken, had annoyed her. She had worked in flight service for years and knew that mistakes happened when someone didn't belong in first class, but this didn't feel like a mistake. She wasn't going to let it go. "Not on her watch," Clarissa asked Mara Patel, a soft-spoken woman with dark hair pulled back into a sleek bun. "Did you check the first-class manifest?" Mara blinked, startled by the question. "Well, yes, the passenger lists are always checked before boarding." "Double-check it," Clarissa insisted, leaving no room for argument. Mara hesitated, looking first at Clarissa and then at Eddie in the cabin. "You think his ticket isn't real?" Clarissa folded her arms and said, "I think he's in the..." "I've seen people try to get into first class by flashing someone else's boarding pass in the hopes they don't get caught." He's dressed well, but I have a feeling about this one. Mira shifted uncomfortably. He scanned in at the gate without a problem. If there was a problem, someone would have reported it. Clarissa let out a sharp breath and said, "Just check, I want to be sure." Mira reluctantly agreed and moved toward the cockpit where the flight records were kept. Clarissa straightened her uniform and turned back toward the cabin, where Edric was sitting. He sat with his hands on the armrests and his eyes fixed ahead, as if he were miles away. He wasn't reading a newspaper or checking his phone like the other passengers. Instead, he silently composed himself and looked ahead. She didn't like it, so she walked back into the aisle and stopped next to his seat, saying, "Sir, I need to see your ticket again." Edric slowly turned his head to meet her gaze, but his face didn't change. He didn't look surprised or shocked. As if he was expecting this, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the boarding pass again, holding it out with the same steady hand. Clarissa took it, carefully reading the details. Seat 1, first class, everything was fine, but her anger only grew. She forced another tight smile and handed the ticket back, saying thank you, but she didn't say anything else. She turned and walked away, ignoring the way some passengers moved in their seats, now aware that something was going on. Jonas Clay looked up from his laptop again and gave Lena Whitmore a knowing look, but neither of them said a word. A short time later, Mara came back from the cockpit with a tense face. She leaned in close to Clarissa and lowered her voice. "His name is on the manifest, he belongs in first class," she said. Clarissa's jaw tightened, and Mara hesitated. "Maybe we should just let it go, he hasn't done anything wrong." Clarissa breathed out her anger through her nose. She wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone like Mira. She muttered, "Fine, but if I see anything fishy, I'll take care of it." She stepped away, but something in her eyes told him she wasn't done yet. Eddie sat there with his expression blank. He had seen this kind of suspicion before in the eyes of strangers who didn't know who he was. Even though he didn't say a word, something inside him told him this wasn't over. The plane taxied toward the walkway, the engines getting louder as the captain's voice cracked over the intercom, welcoming everyone. Eddie adjusted his seatbelt and moved slowly and deliberately. Outside the window, the sun was setting over the airport, casting a warm glow on it. It should have been a peaceful moment, just a normal flight, but Clarissa Vall wouldn't let it go. She stood near the galley with her arms crossed over her chest and her foot tapping on the floor. Something about this didn't feel right to her. She had worked on flights for a long time and knew when something felt off. Colt's presence made her feel like something wasn't quite right. Maya Patel stood next to her and looked toward the cabin before lowering her voice. "Clarissa, you saw the manifest. He should be here." Clarissa barely looked at her, but that doesn't mean it was his ticket. "Whose ticket do you think it is?" Mira asked. Clarissa let out a small scoff. "Come on, Marrera. You've seen it before. People using someone else's name and finding a way to get past security. Maybe he got it from a friend. Maybe someone else." Mira frowned. He's not acting suspicious, and Clarissa's lips formed a thin line. She wasn't going to explain herself, at least not in words. It wasn't about anything specific that Edmund had done, it was just a feeling she couldn't shake. The plane picked up speed, rolling faster down the runway before lifting smoothly into the air. As people settled in for the flight, some leaned back in their seats and others scrolled through their phones. A few minutes went by before the seatbelt sign went off, and the attendants started their normal service routine. Clarissa walked down the aisle with a forced smile on her face as she handed out drinks and small packets of snacks. She barely paid attention to the other passengers because she was busy with her own thoughts. When she got to Eddie's row, she stopped just long enough to put a glass of water on his trade table and asked, "Can I get you anything else?" Eddie looked up at her, but his face was blank, and his voice was deep and steady, the kind that sounded strong even in a whisper. Clarissa lingered for a second too long before stiffly nodding and moving on a few rows back. Jonas Clay watched the interaction through the edge of his glass. He wasn't usually interested in other people's business, but there was something off about the flight attendant's behavior. He had flown first class many times and knew what to do when something fell off. Lena Whitmore, who was sitting next to him, turned the page in her magazine and said, "She's acting weird, isn't she?" Lena raised an eyebrow and asked, "What's your reason?" Jonas didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Eric and watched how the older man sat, calm and collected but fully aware of everything going on around him. Jonas had seen men like Eric before, men who had been through things that others couldn't imagine, and for some reason, that made him uncomfortable. Back at the front of the plane, Clarissa stopped by the service station and pretended to straighten a stack of napkins When she had that thought, her eyes caught on Eddie's leather bag in the overhead bin above his seat. She knew right away what she had to do. She reached for the in-flight phone and called the cockpit. A few seconds later, the captain's voice came through. "This is Captain Harrington." Clarissa lowered her voice and said, "Captain, I have a concern about a passenger in first class." There was a short pause as the captain asked what kind of passenger it was. She hesitated, carefully choosing her words. "I think there's been a security oversight. I need permission to inspect a passenger's belongings on the other end of the line." The captain let out a breath, and Clarissa asked, "Is there a reason for this?" She straightened her shoulders. "Yes, sir. I believe the passenger in seat 1A may be in possession of a ticket that isn't his." There was another pause, and the captain asked, "Do you have proof of that?" Clarissa's grip on the phone tightened. "Not yet, but I'd rather not wait until we land to find out." There was a long silence between them. Finally, the captain spoke clearly, "But if there's nothing wrong, I don't want any complaints about unnecessary searches," Clarissa said quickly before hanging up the phone. Her heart raced as she turned back toward the cabin. She was free to do what she wanted to do. Clarissa took slow, careful steps down the aisle, her eyes fixed on the overhead bin above Eddie Holt's seat. The plane hummed steadily through the sky, and passengers were lost in their own thoughts, unaware of what was about to happen. She had been waiting for this moment. Now she had the perfect reason to show that something wasn't right about him. She stalked next to his row and smiled professionally, but there was tension just below the surface. "Sir," she said, folding her hands in front of her, "I need to ask you to step into the aisle for a moment." Eddie barely responded. He raised his gaze to her face and asked, "Is there a problem?" Clarissa kept her tone. "Even though we're doing a routine security check of carry-on bags, it won't take long." Long Edric's eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite put her finger on. He let out a soft breath and unbuckled his seatbelt. As he moved into the aisle, she reached up and unlatched the overhead bin, pulling down his worn leather bag. It wasn't a special bag by any means, it was just the kind of bag men who valued function over style carried. Other passengers were starting to notice. Jonas Clay lowered his laptop screen a little, his sharp eyes narrowing. Lena Whitmore was still in her seat, her magazine lying across the floor. Mayor Patel stood frozen near the galley, her fingers tightening around the tray she had been carrying. Clarissa put the bag on Eddie's empty seat, rubbing her fingers along the smooth leather before pulling on the zipper. But before she could open it, Eddie's low, firm voice cut through the air. "Do you have a word for that?" This made everyone around her laugh, and Clarissa tilted her head slightly to answer, "Sir, this is an airline security procedure. We're allowed to look for passenger belongings if we..." Eddie didn't move, and what exactly was Eddie's concern? Clarissa met his eyes, but there was something about the way he was looking at her that made her feel uneasy, like he knew what she was going to say before she said it, like he had been through this before and thought it was normal. She answered quickly, unzipping the bag before he could say anything else. As soon as she opened the bag, she felt like dozens of eyes were on her, but as she pulled back the flap, she wasn't able to find anything that would. Her breath caught as she looked inside the bag, which only held clothes, a leather-bound notebook, and a folded newspaper. There was nothing odd or suspicious inside, and it proved her right. Clarissa's fingers curled slightly around the edge of the bag. This didn't make sense, she had been so sure. Eric let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Find what you were looking for." His tone wasn't mocking or angry, it was too calm. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Jonas Clay let out a scream. Clarissa straightened up and said, just following security measures. She quickly zigged the bag shut, picked it up from the seat, and handed it back to Eric. He took it without saying a word, put it back in the overhead bin, and then sat down again, but this time when he leaned back, there was something different about the way he did it that made it clear he had just let her make her own mistake. Clarissa turned quickly and walked toward the bathroom. Mara was still standing in the galley, her eyes filled with a mix of shock and disappointment. You searched his bag, she whispered, making sure no one else could hear. It was any Miri, Clarissa huffed. You didn't find anything. You just embarrassed yourself. Clarissa's jaw tightened. I don't make mistakes, Mara. As she turned back toward the cabin, she saw that people were now looking at her differently. Some were whispering, while others were just watching. Edric sat there as calm as ever, his fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. She had gone looking for proof that he didn't belong, but she ended up proving something else. The flight was still a long way from over, and the tension in the cabin grew heavier, like a storm that hadn't broken yet. The hum of the engines filled the silence that Clarissa Vaughn had left behind, but the damage had already been done. Now people who had ignored her before were paying attention. She could feel the energy shift as people whispered and looked at each other. Clarissa stood stiffly near the galley, gripping the counter with white-knuckled fingers. Her heart pounded under the crisp fabric of her uniform. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had expected, no, she was sure she would find something that proved her suspicion, but Edric Holt had sat there unmoving as she embarrassed herself. Mayor Patel put a cup on the counter next to her and whispered, you should stock this. Maya let out a sigh and looked toward the cabin. People saw what you did, they know it wasn't just protocol, you singled him out, Clarissa said, ignoring the comment and pretended to adjust the stack of napkins next to her. Let's just get back to work, she said. Maya didn't argue, but the look in her eyes said it all. Meanwhile, back in his seat, Eric let out a slow breath and rested his hands lightly on the armrests. He had spent decades learning how to stay calm and stand his ground without saying a word. Although he hadn't said it out loud, Jonas Clay leaned back in his seat a little and spoke in a steady, low voice. That wasn't necessary. Edric turned his head a little and met Jonas's eyes. Jonas gave a small nod toward the galley and said, she has a problem with you. Edric studied him for a moment before looking away. It wasn't the first time someone had a problem with me. Jonas tilted his whiskey glass a little and watched the way the ice moved inside. Maybe not, but I get the feeling she doesn't know who she's messing with. Eddie didn't say anything across the aisle, but Lena Whitmore put down her magazine and said, I hate it when people like her think they can do whatever they want. Jonas smirked and shook his head. It was going to be a long flight. Clarissa walked back into the cabin and tried to keep a calm smile on her face as she checked on passengers. She kept her movements sharp and professional, but she could feel that people were still looking at her differently than they were before. She was refilling a passenger's glass when she heard over the intercom, Miss Bov, please report to the cockpit immediately. The glass in her hand shook a little, so she put it down, took a deep breath, and forced herself to walk forward with a neutral face. But something in her stomach twisted. She had never been called to the cockpit in the middle of a flight, and she knew why. Clarissa's heels clicked against the floor as she walked toward the front of the plane, her back straight, and her face. She tried to stay calm, but she felt uneasy inside. The cockpit door was in front of her, and she hesitated for a second before knocking twice. Almost immediately, a sharp voice answered, "Come in." She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cockpit was dimly lit, and the control panels were glowing softly. Captain Harrington, a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair, turned his seat to face her. Co-pilot Reed, younger but just as serious, kept his eyes on the controls. Clarissa folded her hands in front of her, forcing. A nice smile said, "You needed me," but Captain Harrington didn't return the smile. He leaned back in his chair and lightly tapped his fingers on the armrest. "Would you like to tell me why I just received a direct call from ground control regarding a first-class passenger complaint?" Clarissa asked. "I was conducting a security check," she said. "Smoothly, just standard procedure." The captain's jaw tightened. Is that right? Mr. Hawk asked. He had the right to be in first class and then searched his belongings in front of other passengers. Clarissa stiffened and said, I was just following protocol. Harrington's voice was calm, but there was a weight to it. Tell me, Miss Baugh, what exactly did Mr. Holt do to warrant that suspicion? Clarissa opened her mouth, but she knew better than to say that she had a feeling that something about him didn't sit right with her. Say those words out loud. Harrington didn't need her to answer. He let out a sharp breath and shook his head. Do you even know who that man is? Clarissa frowned. He's just a passenger. The co-pilot let out a quiet laugh that didn't make Harrington laugh. Mr. Holt is a retired brigadier general, a decorated war veteran, and a man who has more flight hours in military aircraft than you'll ever laud in this airline, and you just embarrassed him in front of a plane full of people, Harrington said. Harrington looked at her reaction and sighed. That wasn't even the worst part. Her throat tightened as she asked, What do you mean? Harrington leaned forward a little and said, He didn't report you. Clarissa blinked. He didn't know, Harrington confirmed. But someone else did, and that complaint went straight to the airline's executive office. Clarissa's chest tightened as Harrington's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. His wife was quiet. Clarissa's heart pounded against her ribs, and she licked her. Harrington laughed dryly and shook his head because Miss Baugh wasn't just any wife, she was Eleanor Holt, the owner of this airline. The world fell apart beneath her feet. She was Eleanor Holt, the woman who had built this airline from the ground up. She was Eleanor Holt, the woman whose signature was on every policy, every decision, and every paycheck, including Clarissa's, and she had just disrespected her husband. Clarissa's knees hurt, but she held them in place. The radio crackled with a voice from air traffic control asking for a routine update. Harrington ignored it and lowered his voice to something more dangerous. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk back into that cabin and publicly apologize to Mr. Holt. Clarissa swallowed hard as Harrington continued. When this flight lands, you will be met by airline security and taken directly to the executive office. If I were you, I'd start thinking. If I had to guess, your career just hit turbulence. Clarissa's breathing got faster, and her palms got wet. This wasn't just a complaint anymore, it was about survival. She had thought she was in charge, that she was untouchable, but she had never been more wrong. Clarissa stepped out of the cockpit, her body stiff as she walked back toward the first-class cabin. The weight of what she had just learned hit her like a heavy stone. Eleanor Holt's name kept playing in her mind. Each syllable in her head was louder than the last. How had she not known? How had she not even thought of the possibility? The whispers in the cabin had died down, but the eyes were still there watching her. People who had ignored the situation before were now fully aware that something had changed. They had seen the disrespectful bag search and were now waiting for what would happen next. When she got to Edric Holt's row, she stopped forcing herself to take a slow breath. He hadn't moved, he was sitting there with his hands on the armrests, his eyes fixed out the window as if none of this had affected him, but Clarissa knew better. When she finally spoke, Mr. H turned his head, but she couldn't see his face. Clarissa's voice almost wavered, but she caught it in time. I need to apologize for my behavior earlier. It was unprofessional. She hesitated, hating the words that came next. I was wrong. The cabin was silent. Jonas Clay put down his glass, but she couldn't read Lena Whitmore's expression. People were now paying close attention to Edric. He was quiet for a long time, and then he asked, What did you do wrong? Clarissa blinked and said, I shouldn't have asked about your seat or searched your bag. He studied her, and the silence grew uncomfortable. Then he locked his eyes on hers, and he asked, Why did you do it? Clarissa's face lit up with irritation, discomfort, or something that wasn't said. It was just a misunderstanding, and Edric's gaze didn't waver. Misunderstandings happen when someone does something honest. The speaker's voice was calm and steady, but there was an edge to it. It wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. The words hit Clarissa harder than she thought they would. A few people in the car shifted and looked at each other. She could feel the weight of their judgment and their silent agreement with him. She cleared her throat and said, "I didn't mean you didn't think." Eddie interrupted, his voice still calm but firmer now. "You assumed." Clarissa's heart raced. She was used to being in charge and setting the rules, but right now, in front of all these people, she was the. Jonas Clay let out a breath through his nose and shook his head slightly. Lena crossed her arms, waiting to see what would happen next. Clarissa clenched her jaw and forced a nod. "I understand." Eddie looked at her for another long moment before finally looking away, dismissing the idea that it was worse than if he had yelled at her. Clarissa swallowed and took a step back, clenching her fists at her sides. She had never felt so exposed and small. Mayor Patel was watching from the galley, her lips together. Didn't say anything as Clarissa walked by, but the look in her eyes said, "Enough. You did this to yourself." Clarissa wanted to disappear, but the flight wasn't over yet, and the worst was yet to come. Clarissa hurried back toward the galley, her breath shaky as she stepped out of sight. The cabin was still full of eyes on her, but she wouldn't look back. She could still feel their judgment pressing into her back like 1,000 needles. She had lost control of the situation, and everyone knew it. She crossed her arms over her chest. As she leaned against the counter, her heart was still racing and her mind was still reeling from what she had just been through. She had to say sorry to a man she was sure didn't belong, a man whose wife owned the airline that had hired her and who she had embarrassed in public. Mayor Patel stood a few feet away, quietly putting the drink cart together. She hadn't said a word since the apology, but Clarissa knew she had seen everything Maya finally told her. "Boys, be careful, that must have been hard for you." Clarissa snapped her head up and said, "Excuse me." Mayor met her gaze and said, "I'm sorry, that must have been hard." Clarissa's jaw clenched in frustration. "It was necessary." Mayor gave a slow nod. "And yet you couldn't even admit why you did what you did." Clarissa stiffened and said, "Drop it, Mayor." Mayor exhaled and shook her head. "You still don't get it, do you?" She pointed to the first-class cabin and said, "That man you thought he didn't belong there." Mara didn't push any further, she just went back to the drink cart. Clarissa's chest tightened, but she kept a blank expression on her face. "I don't need a lecture from you." Clarissa straightened her uniform and forced herself to breathe. She just needed to get through this flight. Once they landed, she would figure this out, as she always did. But as she turned to check on the passengers, the intercom went off. "This is Captain Harrington, ladies and gentlemen. We'll begin our descent shortly." Clarissa took a deep breath and swallowed hard. They were landing, which meant she only had minutes left before she had to face Eleanor Holt. She clenched her fists as a cold realization hit her. This wasn't just a complaint anymore, it was about her career and whether it would still exist after today. Clarissa tried to calm down, but the weight of what was about to happen settled deep in her chest. She had made mistakes before, but nothing like this that could end everything. She turned toward the cabin and tried to act normally, but she couldn't ignore the change in energy around her. The passengers weren't just looking at her anymore, they were waiting to see what would happen when the plane touched down. Edgar Colt hadn't moved, he stayed seated and looked straight ahead. If he was angry, he didn't show it, and if he wanted revenge, he wasn't the type of man who would ask for it, which made things worse. Clarissa had seen a lot of bad things. She had dealt with a lot of difficult passengers in her career, including businessmen who yelled when their food was cold and wealthy tourists who threw temper tantrums over last-minute seat changes. But Eddie wasn't like those people. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard, he didn't need to demand power, he already had it, and worse, his wife had it too. She followed him hard, turning toward Mara who was finishing up her final checks. "What happens when we land?" Clarissa asked in a low voice. Mare barely glanced at her. "You know exactly what happens when we land." Clarissa's stomach twisted as security man nodded and said, "We'll be waiting." Clarissa clenched her fingers together. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had always been in charge, making sure everyone followed the rules and was treated with respect. But now she had lost control and there was nothing she could do to get it back. The plane jolted slightly as it descended, thick clouds filled the windows, and people shifted in their seats, excited for landing. Some people looked at their watches or grabbed their bags, but Clarissa felt like time had stopped, trapping her in the last few seconds before her whole career fell apart. She turned away from the cabin and pressed her back against the galley wall, her heart pounding against her ribs. She needed to think of a way out. She thought that if she talked to Mrs. Hull first and said it was all a misunderstanding, she might be able to fix it, but she knew deep down that there was no way out. She had crossed a line. She had crossed a line and done it in front of too many people for her to pretend otherwise. The seatbelt sign went off and the intercom sounded again. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Clarissa took a deep breath and realized this was it. She stepped back into the aisle to check on the rows, but all she could see was Edgar Colt. He was adjusting the sleeve of his suit, and the small military pen on his lapel caught the cabin lights for a second before he straightened up. He wasn't nervous or even worried. Clarissa's skin pricked as she turned away. The runway appeared through the windows, and she could hear the wheels lowering beneath the plane with a dull mechanical hum. The ground was now only seconds away, and Clarissa forced herself to stand tall, making a neutral face so that if she had to go down, she would do it with honor. The tire screeched against the pavement, and the plane shuddered as it slowed down. Passengers breathed out, stretching, and getting ready to leave. Clarissa also let out a breath, but this time it was for her. The plane slowed down as it rolled down the runway, and the hum of the engines changed to a softer, more controlled vibration. The usual routine of landing played out, with the overhead bins rattling slightly and people adjusting in their seats and the muffled clatter of seat belts being unbuckled too soon. But this landing was different. There was no rush to get bags, and people weren't talking about connecting flights. Instead, there was an unspoken tension in the air, and Clarissa could feel it. As the captain made his last announcement over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The time is 3:45 p.m. She stood near the galley with her hands clenched tightly behind her back. His voice was as steady as ever, but Clarissa could hear something new in it, a coldness and a hint of disappointment that she wasn't just another flight attendant. Please stay seated until we get to the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us today." The whole crew had been warned about her, so she took a chance and looked at Edgar Colt. He was sitting exactly the same way he had been before, with his calm face and light hands on the armrest. But there was something deliberate about the way he stayed still and waited, like he knew he had nothing left to prove. Jonas Clay, who was still sitting, took a slow breath out and shut his laptop. "I'd pay," he said under his breath, just loud enough for Lena Whitmore to hear. "People would pay good money to see what happens next." Lena smirked and turned the page of her magazine without really looking at it. "You won't have to pay, just wait." Clarissa's breath was getting faster. She had to move. She had to do something. She had spent her whole career making sure that the flight crew respected her and that passengers knew she was in charge. She had spent years choosing how people were treated, and now she was on the other side of it. The plane made its final turn toward. Through the narrow window near the galley, Clarissa saw something that made her stomach drop. Two uniformed officers stood just beyond the jet bridge, their arms crossed and faces blank. They weren't there to help with routine tasks. They were waiting for someone. They were waiting for her. Mayor Patel walked up to her and said, "You might want to get ready." Clarissa forced a tight, thin-lipped smile. "I can handle it," but Mara didn't return the smile. Clarissa didn't answer. The seatbelt sign went off, and as soon as it did, people moved, but not in the usual frantic rush. There was something different about how they stood, stretched, and adjusted their belongings. They were still waiting. Eddie Holt took his time unbuckling his seatbelt. He wasn't rushing or stalling. He was just moving at his own pace, not caring about what was coming. He reached for his leather bag, the same one Clarissa had searched for no reason, and lifted it with. Before walking down the aisle, Jonas Clay leaned back in his seat and gave Clarissa a quick look before shaking his head and saying, "You really picked the wrong person to mess with." Clarissa ignored him because she had to keep it together. She forced herself to stand tall with her shoulders squared and tried to ignore the rising panic that was grabbing her throat. She had been through worse and been through tough situations before, But as the plane door opened and the two security officers stepped inside, she realized something: there was no. One of the officers, a man with a well-groomed beard and sharp eyes, stepped forward and locked his gaze on her with quiet authority. His voice was calm, steady, and unhurried. Clarissa's whole body went cold. Yes, the officer didn't move or break eye contact. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to silence every conversation in the front rows of the plane. "You'll need to come with us." Clarissa's breath hitched. People were staring, some pretended not to watch, others. Mara softly breathed out next to her and shook her head as if she knew what was going to happen. Clarissa licked her lips and tried to keep her voice even as she asked, "Is there a reason for this?" The second officer, a woman with dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail, raised an eyebrow and said, "There have been reports of mistreatment of a first-class passenger. A formal review has been requested." Clarissa's hands were curled into fists at her sides, and a voice answered from behind her, "By me." Clarissa turned sharply and locked eyes with Edgar Colt. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't gloating, he wasn't even angry. He was just looking at her as if he knew this moment was coming. Clarissa opened her mouth to defend herself, to say anything that might save what little dignity she had left, but the bearded officer cleared his throat and said, "Miss Barr." Clarissa hesitated, but there was no way out of this. She had spent years preparing for this. Clarissa Vaughn was used to walking through airport terminals with her head held high and her uniform clean and well kept, but now she was being escorted off the plane and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The walk down the jet bridge was the longest of her life. The low hum of the terminal could be heard through the thin wall, and the voices of gate agents and departing passengers filled the space, but she barely heard any of it. The only sound that mattered was the steady footsteps of the security officers flanking her, pulling her backwards with each step. Clarissa's mind was racing with what was waiting for her. Would she be fired on the spot, suspended, or even be able to speak in her defense? She had dealt with tough situations with passengers before, but this was different. As soon as the jet bridge opened into the terminal, she saw two airline executives standing a few feet away. Their crisp suits made them look like they were higher up than her, but Clarissa knew that a decision had already been made. Standing just behind them and watching everything with intensity was Eleanor Holt. Clarissa had never met her in person but had seen pictures of a woman with the power in her posture, the intelligence in her sharp gaze, and the unmistakable presence of someone who had built an empire and wouldn't put up with nonsense. She wasn't wearing a business suit like the executives because she didn't need to prove herself with formalities. She stood in sleek navy slacks and a tailored blouse, the kind of. The woman was staring directly at Clarissa. Clarissa's breath caught, but she forced herself to keep walking. As she got closer, one of the executives, a tall man with silver streaks in his hair, tilted his head toward the security officers and said, "That's all we'll handle from here on out." The officers gave a brief nod and stepped away, but Clarissa didn't feel any relief. "Miss Barr," the silver-haired man continued, his voice clipped but controlled, "follow us." Clarissa swallowed hard and didn't argue. The group led her through the terminal, away from the main crowds and toward the private executive lounge, an area of the airport reserved for VIP guests and top-level airline employees. She had seen it before but had never bought inside. The glass doors opened in front of her, letting her into a quiet, dimly lit space with polished floors, expensive furniture, and an air of exclusivity that made her feel small. The executives pointed to a sleek conference room on the right. A long table stretched across the room, perfectly set up as if this moment had been planned ahead of time. Clarissa hesitantly walked in, and the door closed behind her. The silver-haired executive sat down at the head of the table, folded his hands together, and said, "Sit." Clarissa hesitated for only a second before lowering herself into a chair. Then there was silence, which lasted for a long time, suffocating with expectation. Finally, Eleanor Holt broke the silence like a natural disaster. "You don't know who I am, do you?" Clarissa swallowed hard and said, "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor's lips twitched, but it wasn't amusement, it was something colder. "You disrespected my husband," she said. "By sitting down across from me, you embarrassed a man who has served his country and flown more planes than you will ever set foot in. and worse, you did it with full confidence that you were right. Clarissa opened her mouth to defend herself, but Eleanor tilted her head just a little, and that was enough to shut her up. Tell me. Eleanor kept tapping lightly on the table. When you questioned his ticket, when you searched his bag, when you stood there believing without a doubt that he didn't belong, what exactly was it that made you so sure? Clarissa felt her throat tighten. I was just following procedure. Eleanor's eyes darkened. Don't insult my intelligence. The silence that followed was crushing, and Clarissa clenched her fists under the table but didn't dare speak. Eleanor let the silence last for a while, then leaned back in her chair. After a moment, Eleanor asked Clarissa, do you know why? Clarissa shook her head, and Eleanor's eyes flickered to the door. Because he doesn't need to expose people like you, she said. Clarissa's stomach turned, and Eleanor spoke again, this time in a softer but still powerful voice. I built this airline from the ground up. I know every policy, protocol, and rule you tried to hide behind today. And I know the difference between an honest mistake and a choice. The weight of those words hit Clarissa hard in the chest. She wanted to argue, saying that it wasn't personal and that she hadn't meant to cross a line, but deep down she knew that wasn't true. She had made a choice, looked at Edgar cold, and assumed, and now she was paying the price. The silver-haired executive finally spoke again, this time with the finality of a sealed fate. You are officially suspended pending further review. You will be escorted out of the airport immediately. Your access to all airline facilities has been revoked. Clarissa's breath hitched. Eleanor Holt's face didn't change. You should consider yourself lucky. You are immediately terminated. Clarissa wanted to protest to cling to some last bit of control, but there was nothing she could say that would change what had happened. The silver-haired executive stood, signaling that the conversation was over. A formal letter will be sent to you with further details. Security would leave Clarissa out of the building. Clarissa's fingers shook as she stood up. She had been through this airport 1,000 times before. That was her authority, her head held high, but now she was just another former worker being let out like a problem had been solved. She turned toward the door, her movements stiff and robotic. The 2 security guards who had brought her here were already waiting before she stepped out. Ella Orholt spoke one last time. Miss Barr, Clarissa stopped, barely turning her head, and said, if you ever get the chance to work in this industry again, I suggest you remember this moment. As she walked out of the room, past the executives, and into the lounge full of people who hadn't even noticed her fall, Clarissa Barr realized something chilling. She had spent years changing how passengers were treated, and now she was the one being watched, judged, and thrown away, and there was nothing she could do about it. Clarissa Ball walked through the airport terminal in a daze, every step feeling heavier than the last time she had been kicked off a flight. Never like this before, never with security walking next to her, and never with her uniform feeling like a burden instead of a badge of authority. The whispers started almost right away as people walked by, some recognizing her from the flight and others just noticing the strange sight of a flight attendant being let out instead of leading the way. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but there was a wave of curiosity, a few quick glances, and people turning their heads just slightly to whisper something to the person walking next to them. She knew what it was like to be judged before you even spoke, and now, for the first time, she was the one being judged. As Clarissa walked by, a gate agent near the boarding desk stiffened. She must have already heard the words, because they spread quickly in the airline world. The security officers on either side of her stayed silent, treating her like a problem they were supposed to solve. Clarissa clenched her jaw. For so long, she had been in charge, the one who people listened to, the one who set the tone. She was now a cautionary tale on every flight she worked. As the automatic doors leading out of the airport slid open, the rush of city air hit her face like a slap. Everything felt different. The airport she had once walked through with pride and confidence now felt foreign, like she had been erased from it. A black luxury car sat parked near the curb, its back door open waiting for someone. That's when she saw him, Edgar Holt. He stood next to the car, his posture was relaxed, and he couldn't be read as she approached. Just being in his presence stopped her in her tracks. Clarissa's breath caught. She thought she would never see him again and that he would be done with her as soon as she got off the plane, but he stayed waiting. The security guards gave her a quick nod and then stepped back, their job done. She was no longer their problem for the first time since this all began. Clarissa was all by herself. Eddie studied her, watching how she held herself and how her hands twitched slightly at her sides. Finally, he spoke. "Don't get it," Clarissa said, her voice caught in his. He shook his head, but there was no anger or satisfaction in his eyes. Instead, they were sharp with understanding. "You were wrong because you searched my bag," he said. "You were wrong because you questioned me. You were wrong because you already knew the answer before I opened my mouth." Clarissa looked away, feeling ashamed. Edric exhaled and shifted his weight slightly. "You've been given authority for so long that you forgot what it feels like to be on the other side of it, and now that you're here, you don't know what to do with yourself." Clarissa clenched her fist and said, "I didn't mean what you asked." The words hit her harder than she thought they would because she already knew the answer. Edric looked at her for a moment longer before shaking his head and saying, "Miss Barr, you can walk away from this pretending you were just unlucky that you were treated unfairly, or he let the situation continue. Or you can take a good look at yourself and ask why it happened in the first place." Clarissa wanted to fight back and say something sharp, defensive, or that put her back in charge, but there were no rules to enforce, no policies to hide behind, and no power to lean on. For the first time in her career, she was just a person standing in front of someone she had wronged, and there was nowhere to run. She swallowed hard and asked herself, what if I do take a real look at myself? There was a long pause between them, and then Edric turned around and walked into the waiting car. Clarissa watched as the door closed behind him and the sleek black car pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the city. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding for the first time since getting on that plane. She felt small, not because she had lost her job or been embarrassed, but because she finally understood what had happened. It had never been about Eddie Holt, it was about her, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure who she was. Clarissa Baugh stood frozen on the curb long after the black car had driven off into the city. The sound of honking taxis and the distant hum of jet engines filled the air, but it all felt far away, like she wasn't in the world she used to control. She had spent years walking through airport terminals with purpose, her uniform a sign of authority, but now that it was over, she didn't know where to go. Passers-by and co-workers she used to work with ignored her. She wasn't one of them anymore. She wasn't anything. Her legs hurt, but she forced herself to move, stepping off the curb and walking toward the nearest bench. She needed a moment to think, but it was dangerous to think because all she could hear was Eddie Holt's voice. "You already knew the answer before I even opened my mouth. You were wrong because you searched my bag. You were wrong because you assumed I." Clarissa closed her eyes and tried to forget about it, to act like it was just another bad day. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just a bad day. It was the moment when everything she thought about herself came crashing down. She had spent her whole career believing she was right, that her judgment, her instincts, and her authority were unquestionable. Now, sitting on a cold metal bench outside of an airport she might never work at again, she had to ask herself the question she had been avoiding. Was avoiding all along. What if she had been wrong? The thought made her feel sick. She leaned forward and tangled her fingers in her hair. She had worked so hard to get where she was and had given up so much to be respected in a field that didn't give second chances. She had told herself that being tough, strict, and in charge was the only way to stay alive, but what had it gotten her? She thought she was strong, but what kind of strength? The answer hit her harder than she thought it would. She had never been strong because she was afraid of losing control, being questioned, and being found out. She was afraid that if she didn't always enforce authority, people would see right through her, and now they did. She let out a slow, unsteady breath across the street as a digital billboard showed an airline ad with happy, smiling flight attendants and passengers traveling to a world of endless destinations. Clarissa had been a part of that world, but now she didn't know what it was like. She shook a little as she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She had to know. She typed Edric Holt into the search bar with trembling fingers. The results came up right away. Brigadier General Eric Holt was a decorated war hero who had led missions in combat zones, spoken at memorial events, and been in interviews about leadership and resilience. Eleanor Holt and Brigadier General Eric Holt were the power couple behind one of the world's most successful companies. Clarissa looked at the screen with a racing heart. She had slandered a man who had built a legacy, a man with more experience, history, and worth than she had ever bothered to think about, and she had done it just because she thought she could. A lump formed in her throat, hard and unforgiving. She hovered her fingers over the phone screen, wondering what she was even looking for, an excuse, a reason to justify her actions, some hidden scandal that would make her feel less guilty. There was nothing because the truth was already out. She had spent so much time seeing herself as the boss and the one who set the rules, but now she had to face the one thing she had never thought about before: she was the problem. She let the phone fall into her lap and stared out at the busy street. She had lost her job and her reputation, but for the first time, she wasn't mad at anyone but herself because Eric Holt hadn't had to punish her. He had just let her face the consequences of her own actions. Clarissa sat on the bench. Outside the airport, she could hear the sounds of the world going by, but she didn't feel like she was a part of it anymore. Her uniform, title, and authority had been taken away. She had spent years thinking she was in charge and decided who belonged where and who was right and wrong, but today had shattered that illusion. She had spent years telling herself she had done what was best for the airline by following protocol and enforcing security, but none of it had been true. Even though she had seen Eddie Holt, she had already made up her mind about him, and everything she did afterward was just her justifying what she had already decided. Now she was outside, not in the airport or the sky, walking the aisles with the power of a uniform, on the edges of the world she used to control. A cool gust of wind blew against her face, carrying the smell of jet fuel and exhaust from the line of taxis waiting at the curb. A group of flight attendants in mini uniforms walked past them. They were talking and looking confident, and they barely glanced at her. A few hours ago, she had been one of them, but now she was invisible. Her phone vibrated in her lap, waking her up. She looked down at the screen and saw a message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. "Your final evaluation meeting is tomorrow at 9 a.m. Arrive on time." Clarissa let out a sharp breath. Final evaluation. That was business speak for one last chance to defend herself before the decision was made official. But what could she say? Would she say that she hadn't meant to disrespect Eric Holt, that she had been acting in the best interest of the airline, that it was all a misunderstanding? The truth was that none of those things would be true, and even if she did manage to keep her job, what would be left of her reputation? The attendants and passengers had seen what happened, and she would never be in charge again. She put the phone back in her lap and leaned forward, pressing her hands together. It would have been easy to go to that meeting and play the victim, crying about how unfair it was that she had been singled out and punished too harshly, but she knew in her heart that this wasn't about one mistake, it was about a pattern. How many times had she questioned passengers who didn't look like they belonged in the plane? How many times had she treated people differently because of an assumption she had made about them as soon as they stepped on the plane? And how many times had she gotten away with it because no one had called her out? She had a cold realization that maybe this was the first time she was being punished, but it wasn't the first time she had been wrong. She thought about Eric Holt's last words to her: "Miss Barr, you have a choice. You can walk away from this pretending you were just unlucky that you were. You can either look at yourself and ask why it happened in the first place, or you can be treated unfairly." Clarissa closed her eyes. She wasn't sure if she had the courage to ask herself that question, because if she did, she wasn't sure she would like the answer. The street in front of her was busy with people running to catch flights, taxi drivers waving at customers, and families saying goodbye. The world was still going on without her. For so long, she had thought that being in charge meant never being. Clarissa sat there for what seemed like hours watching the world go by. She had spent her whole career telling herself she was in charge, that she had earned her position, and that her judgment was what kept things in order. But now, as she sat there, she wondered if real control wasn't about having power over other people, maybe it was about having the power to change things. Maybe the real question wasn't what would happen to her job, maybe it was who she would be if she lost it. Outside the airport she used to run, she finally realized she had been living a lie. Control had never been about power, it had been about how she saw herself and how she thought others saw her. She thought people respected her because she was strict and wouldn't bend, but what she was really afraid of was being questioned and admitting that her authority wasn't always justified. She was afraid that if she didn't hold on to power with an iron fist, people would think she wasn't trustworthy. In the end, she was right. The airline had taken it away from her not because she had done anything terrible, but because she had let herself believe she was untouchable. Now she was nothing. Her phone buzzed again, reminding her of the meeting she had tomorrow morning. It was her last chance to fight for her job, but she wasn't sure she wanted it for the first time. Clarissa let out a breath as she stood up from the bench. Her legs were stiff from sitting for so long. If she wanted to save her career, The result of Clarissa's phone search for Eleanor Holt's office address showed up a few seconds later. She hesitated. She had already embarrassed herself once today, and she had lost almost everything. What good would it do to push herself even more? Then she remembered what Eddie had said. Miss Bov, you have a choice. You can pretend that this wasn't fair, or you can take a real look at yourself. For years, Clarissa had decided who deserved what, and now, for the first time, she had to. She knew she had to be ready if she had to face Elaine or Holt the next day. The next morning, Clarissa got to the airline executive office an hour early for her meeting. She sat in the lobby with her hands in her lap and her fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt while executives walked in and out having quiet but important conversations. No one paid her any attention, they didn't know who she was and she didn't think they cared. It was a strange feeling because she had walked past them for years. She used to walk through airports knowing that people saw her, respected her, and admired her, but now she was just another name on a suspension list. Eventually, a receptionist called her name and said, "Mrs. Holt will see you now." Clarissa stood there, smoothing her uniform out of habit, before realizing that it wasn't her uniform anymore. She had worn a simple blouse and skirt, which was businesslike but not standout. She had no title and no authority to back her up, she was just herself. She followed the receptionist down a long hallway until they reached a large room. The door to Eleanor Holt's office was already open, and she was sitting behind a sleek mahogany desk with her posture perfectly straight and her sharp eyes spanning over a document. She didn't look up right away, but Clarissa did as she was told and sat down across from her. For the first time in years, she felt small. Eleanor finally put the document down and folded her hands together, saying, "You're here to convince me to reinstate you." Clarissa swallowed, and before she could say anything, Eleanor cut her off, tilting her head slightly. "Answer one question for me." Eleanor looked at Clarissa with a sharp, knife-like gaze and asked, "Why do you want this job back?" Clarissa opened her mouth but couldn't say anything. She had practiced every defense, every excuse, and every way she could say she deserved another chance, but as soon as Eleanor asked that question, she realized something horrifying: she didn't have an answer. For years, she had seen her job as proof of how important she was, how respected she was, how needed she was. But had she ever really cared about the job itself? Had she ever? Whether she really cared about the passengers' well-being or just wanted to make sure they knew she was in charge? Eleanor watched her while she waited. Clarissa took a deep breath and then, for the first time in her life, told the truth. "I don't know," she said. Eleanor didn't seem surprised. Clarissa swallowed hard. "I thought I wanted this job because I worked hard for it because I earned it, but if I was willing to kick people off a flight just because I thought something about them, then maybe I never earned it at all." Eleanor leaned back. Clarissa's chest tightened. "I don't expect you to give me my job back," she said, exhaling. "I don't want to lead this meeting pretending I was the victim." Eleanor looked at her for a long time, then she reached for a document on her desk and slid it forward. Clarissa's heart raced. Was this her firing letter, a final statement saying she was fired for good? When she looked down, she caught her breath. It wasn't a termination notice, it was an offer. "Reassignment," Clarissa blinked and said, "I don't understand." Ellen curled her fingers together and said, "You were a great flight attendant by technical standards. You knew the rules, you enforced them, and you kept order, but you didn't understand the responsibility that comes with that authority." Clarissa hesitated, and Ellen said, "I think you might." Clarissa looked at the paper again. It wasn't a promotion to her old job, it was a demotion to a ground crew job. "You want me working the gates?" Clarissa asked, her voice almost lowered. "If you accept it." Clarissa's fingers tightened around the edge of the paper, and Eleanor beat a small knowing smile. "Then you walk away and go back to being the person you were before this," she said. Clarissa didn't say anything for a long time, then slowly picked up the pen. She had spent years believing that power meant never admitting weakness, but maybe real power was knowing when to start over. She signed her name, and Eleanor took the paper, nodded once, and stood. "Start Monday." Clarissa stood up and gave a short nod. She had lost everything, but maybe she had found something better. As she walked out of the office and into the busy airport, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, the chance to finally be better than she was before. If you liked the story, please like the video and let us know what you think in the comments below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.